Have you ever felt like a pigeon, head bobbing and turning in circles, pecking aimlessly in the service of some elusive dopamine rush? Though behavioral psychology, or behaviorism, has been criticized for being reductionist and dehumanizing, there is wisdom to be found even in the most reductionist approaches to human behavior. A reductionist approach can sometimes cut through the noise in a signal to facilitate our arrival at an appreciation of the signal itself. In fact, it can sometimes cut through the inevitable noise when trying to decipher the behavior of our fellow human beings, complicated and flawed as they are, as well as that of ourselves, as if we can be in any doubt about our own complicated and flawed nature. As humans, we have a strong sense that nobody could have a better understanding of our inner lives, and therefore the motivations underpinning our behaviors, than ourselves. This makes intuitive sense, given that we are the most intimate with our own inner lives, especially insofar as this is taken to mean something like direct access to the contents of our consciousness. This is known as the heterophenomenological bias. It is a term coined by philosopher and cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett to describe the tendency for individuals to rely too heavily on subjective, first-person accounts of their own mental experiences without considering the possibility of error, inconsistency, or distortion in those accounts. In other words, it refers to the bias or tendency to take people's reports of their own inner experiences at face value, without sufficient critical evaluation or skepticism. Behavioral psychology, also known as behaviorism, is a branch of psychology that focuses on the study of observable behavior and the environmental factors that influence it. The field is characterized by an emphasis on experimental methods, data-driven analysis, and the use of conditioning and reinforcement techniques to modify behavior. There were several key phases in the development of behavioral psychology, each with its own unique contributions to the field. The first phase encompasses Pavlov's salivating dog, a concept that has firmly taken its place in popular culture and public consciousness, even to the extent that it has become synonymous with behaviorism itself. In fact, the insights gained from this approach only informed the first phase in behavioral psychology's evolution. Pavlov's dog is an example of classical conditioning, which began with Ivan Pavlov's work in the late 19th century. His experiments with dogs showed that behavior could be conditioned through the pairing of a neutral stimulus, such as a bell, with a biologically significant stimulus, such as food. This led to the development of classical conditioning, which involves the learning of associations between stimuli and responses. What differentiates the different schools of behavioral psychology is the degree to which cognition, or thought and reflection, come into play between stimulus and response in comprising the explanation for any given behavior. Needless to say, classical conditioning assumes no such cognition. It is instead characterized by a direct pairing of stimulus and response, rendering he or she who is thus conditioned a passive node, receiving a stimulus and outputting a response. This clearly doesn't sound very human, but that doesn't necessarily preclude its predictive or explanatory power. By contrast, operant conditioning is the phase of behavioral psychology that began with the work of B.F. Skinner in the mid-20th century. Skinner's experiments with rats and pigeons showed that behaviour could be shaped and reinforced through the use of rewards and punishments. This led to the development of operant conditioning, which involves the learning of associations between behaviours and their consequences. While operant conditioning does not necessarily require explicit cognition or conscious awareness, it does involve some form of learning, which can imply cognitive processing. For example, in classic experiments by B.F. Skinner, rats were trained to press a lever to receive a food pellet. While the rats may not have had explicit knowledge or awareness of the learning process, their behaviour clearly reflected a change in their cognitive processes as they learned to associate the lever press with the delivery of the food pellet. The principles of operant conditioning can be applied more effectively when an individual has some degree of cognitive awareness, as they are better able to understand the relationship between their behaviour and the consequences that follow. Thus, while operant conditioning does not require explicit cognition, it does involve some degree of cognitive processing and may be more effective when the individual has some level of cognitive awareness. These earlier forms of behavioral psychology eventually gave birth to social learning theory. This phase of behavioral psychology began with the work of Albert Bandura in the 1960s. Bandura's experiments showed that behaviour could be learned through observation and modelling. This led to the development of social learning theory, which emphasises the role of social interaction and cognitive processes in learning and behaviour. This concept only differs substantially from operant conditioning in the sense that social learning occurs through a process of vicarious reinforcement in which individuals observe the behaviour of others and the consequences that follow and adjust their own behaviour accordingly. As mentioned, one of the main criticisms of behaviorism is that it is considered reductionist when it comes to human behaviour and motivations. The charge is that behaviorism oversimplifies the complexity of human behaviour by reducing it to observable responses to environmental stimuli, while ignoring internal mental processes and subjective experiences that motivate behaviour. However, while there is a tendency to dismiss paradigms outright on this basis, there is surely still wisdom to be gleaned. Of all the figures associated with behavioral psychology, B.F. Skinner could be considered a true believer. He developed a controversial concept of radical behaviorism, which rejected the traditional distinction between private mental events, such as thoughts and feelings, and public observable behaviour, arguing that all behaviour is ultimately shaped by environmental factors, and that subjective mental experiences are irrelevant to the study of behaviour. In his essay, Superstition in the Pigeon, B.F. Skinner describes an experiment in which pigeons were placed in a chamber and given food pellets at fixed intervals, regardless of their behaviours. Skinner found that the pigeons began to display superstitious behaviours, performing repetitive actions such as head bobbing and turning in circles, which they believed were associated in some way with the delivery of food. Skinner suggests that the pigeons' superstitious behaviours are a result of their natural tendency to associate events with one another, even if there is no logical or causal connection between them. This tendency, he argues, is a fundamental aspect of learning and behaviours, and can be observed in many different species, even human beings. Skinner suggests that superstition and other irrational beliefs may be a natural consequence of this cognitive process. He interpreted his findings as evidence of the pigeon's propensity to develop superstitious beliefs and behaviours in response to unpredictable or uncontrollable events, and argued that this tendency was not unique to pigeons, but also applied to human behaviour. He suggested that superstitious beliefs and behaviours could arise when individuals are exposed to unpredictable or random events, and that these beliefs and behaviours can persist even in the absence of any real causal relationship. This requires further explanation. The key concept underlying operant conditioning that ultimately leads to the manifestation of superstitious behaviour is the reinforcement schedule. In operant conditioning, a reinforcement schedule refers to the specific pattern or frequency with which a behaviour is reinforced or rewarded. There are several different types of reinforcement schedule, each with its own unique pattern of reinforcement. It seems to be that at precisely the point that a reinforcement schedule becomes opaque, where cognition cannot effectively intervene, whether this be due to rapid, lazy and unmotivated thinking, or the sheer indecipherability of the reinforcement schedule itself, as well as there being sufficiently frequent rewards to keep us engaged with striving for such rewards, what we might deem to be behavioural aberrations begin to occur. That is to say, we can find ourselves ushered into realms of behaviour that are, to all practical intents and purposes, irrational. Perhaps even more pernicious is when the repetitive behaviours we find ourselves exhibiting no longer serve us, and yet persist, having escaped conscious reflection and submission to a rational cost-benefit analysis. Herein lies the subtle power of the carefully tweaked reinforcement schedule. This should immediately make you think of the fast dopamine diet we can often find ourselves on, given the ever more tweaked society in which we live. Could it be that algorithms are using dark arts gleaned from an appreciation of the same insight provided by behavioral psychology to keep us in a perpetual state of dumb confusion as we scroll aimlessly, pecking like pigeons for the elusive dopamine grain? Perhaps the time has come for us to examine the Skinner boxes we inhabit and take stock of the levers we have grown so accustomed to pushing. Sensationalist as it may seem, one could imagine, with the correct application of mindfulness practices and radical reflection on who we are, what we want, and an appreciation of the notion that if we are not acting mindfully to chart a course for our own lives, someone or something will always be ready to chart the course for us. We would be able to attain a state of greater freedom and peace. In a moment of profound introspection, Truman pauses on the set's edge and looks out at the limitless blue sky, taking in the true magnitude and beauty of the world around him for the first time. He realizes that the world is far bigger, richer, and more complex than he ever could have imagined. The experience is a potent metaphor for the transformative power of self-discovery and the boundless potential of the human spirit.